Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We finished page 1462. And with this, we also finished a major subsection in Ayin Beis that goes back literally to page 1352. So we're talking about 110 pages. 110 pages. Let's sum up what we learned, and then we shall continue. So, yesterday we finished the parentheses that on page 1462, and the parentheses was in context of the Riyah, the state of awareness and cognizance and perception. Remember, Riyah is not just technically seeing something, it's experiencing something with a resonance of sight. That's the key thing to remember. Makes it a little easier to understand. Because someone says they see godliness, where do they see it? They see it like they see the table. Today we don't see it that way. But the question is the level of reality, the level of how much it resonates as a truth in your life. So in the senses, in the five senses, Riyah is the highest level of resonance. It's not necessarily the highest level of experience, because, for example, you can hear something and internalize it a lot more. Smell has its power. We actually learned about all these senses. There's touch, there's taste, but in context of seeing is believing, the idea when you see something, it's as real as it can be, meaning I saw it with my own eyes type of thing. So through his bonumnus, like he said, Asoga Gemura, through a proper contemplation and understanding, you can come close to perceiving things on that level when you sense its truth and its reality, that resonating element, you say, this is absolutely true. So in that sense, Riyah has been, of course, a critical piece in this whole section that began on 1352. I'll talk about that more briefly, but in a moment, I want to first sum up what we were learning here. So learning here, concluding the few verses he brought, Umidabrech Nava, your words are beautiful, or the Midbar, Umimidbar Asheri Isa, that the Midbar leads to beauty. The Midbar leads to Re'isa, to vision. Midbar Shchera Nivanova, the darkness of the desolate wilderness of the spirituality that's concealed, the divine that's concealed in this world, that itself is the catalyst that propels, that triggers us to be able to experience deep thirst and longing, rotze, to godliness, which in the parentheses we learn has two aspects to it. One is the vision as in the rotze, seeing something, so yearning for it. When you see something, you really want it. And the second is the sating and satisfaction that Riyah brings, the shuv, that follows the rotze, which is that through Torah mitzvahs, we satisfy, we quench that thirst. And that too is a level of Riyah b'bchinas shuv. So it's Riyah b'chinas rotze, Riyah b'chinas shuv. Doesn't elaborate much more than that, but that was the key point that we learned in the parentheses. Okay. And of course, there are many details in all of this. And the bottom line is that all this is what the soul says. The soul below says to the soul above, to its counterpart above, B'nai Yerushalayim, the daughters of Yerushalayim, that you are Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a state of, well, that doesn't say Yerushalayim. That's not what the Neshama said. B'nai Yerushalayim is the level of complete reverence, as we learn Bittul B'mitzias, Yiri Ilah of the Neshamas above in Atzilus. But the Neshama below says, I am dark, but I am beautiful. Because that darkness leads to a far deeper a thirst and connection, and ultimately awareness of Atzmus itself, and awareness also that the B'nai Yerushalayim themselves and all the higher levels, they too, compared to Atzmus, are lifeless and desolate, as we learned in the last pages. But now, that was a summary of what we learned, and that was the conclusion to the bottom of the page. Dafke biridasa ba'asiyah, dafke nasiyah, you have this Eir Hariyah, because dafke there comes the Yisran Eir, that special or unique and unprecedented energy or light, bizgalus b'chinas ha'atzmus. So now I want to go back and just really do a summary of everything we learned, not everything, but at least highlights of what we learned, starting from page 1352. And you'll see that will take us back to 1350, and that is the continuation what we're going to learn on page 1463. So if you look at these 110 pages that I'm holding right here, that he began when he started explaining I'm reading on 1352. So what did he come to explain with Er Hariyah? He came to explain the idea of Ner Mitzvah v'Teira and Ner Hashem Nishmas. That both mitzvahs is called a Ner, a flame or fire or a candle, and Neshama is called a candle. And he explained what those are. We're going to go into more detail shortly about that as well. That came back on page 1350, where he began a whole new section that after explaining over 500 pages, the interface, Mamata Lamaila. If you look at the bottom of 1349, you'll see, Zeo Tachlis Haved Tfilah B'chinas Halal Mamata Lamaila, Miyesh La'ayin, Lahamshach Ha'er De'ein Sof, Hashayach Le'el Mishrim, Mishach Ha'er K'meshu Be'esem, B'li Levush V'Helem. So that was a long discussion how we climbed from the bottom up, and this included all the way to the level of Einoid, even though the Rebbe Rashab made it clear that Einoid is even a deeper level in all of that. So then on top of 1350, he said, the Ma'atet Tzarech Lahav Inyan HaTeira. Now we have to go back to where it all began. Where did it all begin? It began back in the middle of volume 2. And now we'll talk about how it is Mamayla Mata, Shebechinas Hamshachah Mamayla Mata, Ma'ayin Liyesh. To go from the ayin to the yesh, instead of from the yesh to the ayin. Because Teira is Bechinas Shema, is ayin, it's chachmeh, and it's drawn down Mamayla Lamata into existence. So from the ayin becomes a yesh, and that in turn gives us the power to transform the yesh. So there's through tefillah we do it from the bottom up in general terms, and from the Teira from the top down. Then he began on the 5th line of page 1350. He said, but he will understand by understanding the verse Ner Mitzvah v'Teira Er, and the mitzvah is called Ner, Teira is called Er, and then he goes also Gam Tzarech Uksiv Ner Hashem Nishmas. So he's using the example of he's using the verses that refer to a mitzvah as a candle, Teira as light, and Hashem as a candle. And he explained that for 2 pages, and then he said, with that, in order to understand that, it appears to me the best way to explain this, or the way to explain this, is through Er Hariyah, and that's where he first introduced the eyesight, which led us into a whole 3 different levels of Er HaMakabel of Malchus, the eyesight, the moonlight, the luminous stone. And that began a long discussion, page 1352, that went on through Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, that in Teira you have all 3 levels. And then he went back, after finishing with Teira, the 3 levels, he went back to the fact that this corresponds to Malchus of Bria, that's the moonlight, Malchus of Yetzirah, that's the luminous stone, and Malchus of Asiyah, that's Riyah. So then he went on to explain, firstly, the moonlight at length, and the luminous stone. Then, just to give you the pages, after he finished with the Teira, okay, luminous stone, I'm just going back here. Here we are. And in Teira itself, we also discovered that through Teira Shalapeh, you come from Cheshach, but Machshak and Meshivani, we also come from a darkness, from a lack of clarity, the later generations that did not have that clarity that received, like the Tanoim received the Mishnah, they receive ish mipi ish, a certain clarity, mamayla lamata. So in Teira itself, you find the mamata lamayla. That we learned. And then, let's just go further. Yeah. On page 1386, he explained here, according to everything we learned, we'll understand the difference between the 3 types of the moonlight, the luminous stone, and Er Hariyah, which corresponds to those malchus of those 3 worlds. Yeah, so that begins, the moon is on 1386. On 1388 was the mashal of the luminous stone, which went for quite a few pages. And then, let me see. Yeah, and on page 1398, he said, Ma'ata tzarech lahavan ha-moshel de Er Hariyah. So after all that, he went back to Eir Hariyah, and that began with Eir Hariyah, the whole idea of that the Riyah can see, but it needs a light that supports it. Whereas the moon and the luminous stone, they reflect the sun, and therefore they shine, but they don't need another extra light. That's their process. This eye, on the other hand, the eye itself sees, unlike the moon and the stone, the luminous stone, but it needs a support. And that began the discussion with the Einei Ha'eda, the leaders, and Moshe Rabbeinu, and that finally led to the Malachim that was on page, here we go, on page 1408. The Malachim are the eyes, the Neshamas are compared to the pupil of the eye. Before that, I should have mentioned the two levels of the soul as they are higher than everything. That's like the Etzem Koyach Hariyah, and the soul as it comes down below, and then Torah is higher than the Neshama, and it radiates and illuminates the Neshama, like we spoke about, Torah Eir. And then when the whole Arichas with the Malachim, how the Malachim support, but on the other hand, the Neshamas are higher, and as a result of the Malachim support, the Pirchas Yetzer that comes before Krishma, then in Krishma, the Neshamas elevate even higher and also elevate the angels with them, as we learned that. In that whole piece also came the whole idea of Kol HaMayrich Be'echad, and Kol and Ayin Yesh Meiraba B'chol Keichei. That was that whole lengthy and elaborate contemplation on Echad that a neshama does with the support of the angels that help us achieve that contemplation, and that reaches higher and higher all the way the bittul of the lowest levels, all the way as it's encompassed in Atzmus. Okay, and this continued on and on, page 14, 28, 24, spoke about the Neshamas and the Malachim again, Malachim being the processors, Homumei, like the digestive process, the gut, and that long discussion. Okay, just going through this quickly. Let's see here. Then on page 1434, went back to the Neshamas being even higher than the Malachim. That brought us to Krishma being the Ramach, Evarim the Malka. Ramach, the mitzvahs of Ramach, which began the Kutsha Bricha, Yichud Kutsha Bricha V'Shchinta, all the levels of Shchina and Kutsha Bricha, all the way to the highest levels that the Neshamas achieve. That concluded on page 1441. And then talked about how the Yesh below reaches all the way to the Shtaba Begufet the Malka, reaches all the way to Atzmus. Only the Yesh. The Ein Arech, that infinite apartness, only the Neshamas below reach. But then again, in Zman HaGolus, especially in Zman HaGolus, they need the angels. The angel, the whole discussion about the angel that was sent by Hashem after the Chet HaEgel to lead the people because they guide the Amshach from Matzilus into Biyah. That's page 1444. So Neshama Lamata needs these interfaces, but then Neshama Lamayla. And the final piece was Achalti Yari im Divshi. Yar and Divshi, that's the honey and the honeycomb, or the sugar and the sugar cane. That's Krishma, is the sugar. And the sugar cane is the Yetzer. That went for page 1451 through page 1454. And then came back to Riyas Ayin, this last section that we've been learning from page 1454 till here, 1462. He says, let's now understand the Moshli goes back to Eir Hariyah. Eir Hariyah can see, but it needs the support of Eir, like the support of the Malachim. And then on 1455, he said, according to the, we'll understand, I am dark but beautiful. And that I just summed up at the beginning of this class, the Shcheda Nivanova, all the different elements, how the Midbar and the darkness, that itself elicits the highest levels. So that's already even a deeper point. Not just that the Neshama, with the support of the angels, reaches high levels, but it's actually dafke, below that, the Neshama is below. Not the Neshamas above, but the Neshamas below that have the capacity to reach these highest levels. And with that, we concluded. And now he's ready to go back to page 1352, 1350, I should say, which is about Ner Mitzvah v'Torah Er. Okay, so that was a summary of everything we've learned. Now, to understand Ner Mitzvah, to understand what we're going to learn now on page 1463, I think it's worthwhile summarizing what we learned on page 1350 through 1352. I would even read it inside, but I think it'll be easier for me to just go, if you can follow along if you like. I'm going to page 1350 now, and I'm just going to summarize. I'm not going to read the whole text. I'll just highlight a few points. And basically, it comes down to this. It's based on Torah Er, where the Alter Rebbe explains Ner. What is a candle? The fact that you compare a mitzvah to a candle, and a neshama to a candle, Ner Mitzvah, the Torah Er, Ner Hashem, Nishmas Adam. So that we saw understanding what a candle, dissecting the very makeup of a candle, will help us understand why the verse uses that example, and all that will be understood well with all the 110 pages that we just learned. So let's just go over what did he say on page 1350. So briefly, this is vital to understand the whole flow. Okay, so both the mitzvahs and the neshama are called ner, and he explains them separately. First, he starts with the neshama, and on the bottom of 1351, he talks about a mitzvah in the same way. So the Alter Rebbe explains, and the Rebbe Rashab cites that a ner consists. One second. Gimel Dvarim. A ner consists of three elements: psila, a wick; shemen, the fuel, the oil; and the oir, and the fire that it creates. Without those three, you don't have a candle. So a candle, if you only have, for example, fuel, oil, without a wick, there's nothing to burn. Yes, you can light the oil and it'll burn out very quickly, but it won't be a candle. If you only have a wick without oil, so you have a wick, but you don't have fuel. And of course, the fire is the result of lighting the wick, which draws, literally sucks out, absorbs slowly the oil, creating a fire that burns slowly as well until it runs out of fuel. This is the Ner Shabbos, Ner Chanukah, the Ner is in the Beis Hamikdash. This is what a Ner is like. Three things. But what do these represent in Aveda? That's what he discusses there. So first, let's talk more about the details. So he says, yeah, Hashem and Atzme lo yehoyedelik, adrab ha'esh nichva b'shemen. If you lit a fire with the shemen will overwhelm the fire. You need the wick to be like in the intermediary here. The psila serves like a keli to the oir, like a container to the light. Shenechas ba'psila dafka. So when you look at a flame, you don't see the flame burning from the fuel. The fuel is feeding the psila, the wick, and the flame is the wick. The wick is burning. That's what he says. These details are relevant, as we'll see. On the other hand, if you only had a psila without shemen, the psila hayanisrav tir nichla miyad, the wick would have burned out immediately. You light a wick and there's no fuel, it'll just as long as it lasts, but it's going to be very quick. Like he says, and through the shemen slowly is absorbed by the wick, and that causes the flame. Okay. Calls the psila mamutza bena'er v'hashemen, because what is running out as the fire burns? What is being slowly? What's the word I would use? Slowly, not dissolving. Slowly dissipate. Not dissipating. What do you say? The fuel begins to run out. There's a word for it. The fuel begins to
consumed.
Maybe consumes it. Basically, the fuel gets lower and lower. The wick remains intact throughout, because the wick is just serving as a conduit. It's the fuel that is being consumed and slowly gets less and less, and that's what feeds the wick and create the fire. That's what he says here. Shehi mesheches es hashemen el ha'er. It draws the oil or the fuel to the light, to the flame. Now, what is that in context of a neshama and a mitzvah? They say that a neshama is called Ner Neshomo. What are these three things in the neshama? So here's how it works. That in neshama, there's three things as well. Ner Neshomo, hapsilahu hanefesh alikis. The wick is the divine soul. And he explains that for a while, brings sources for that. Just a minute. Yeah. Psila is like Malchus, which is like a keli. And like the Nefesh Shalikis, it's a keli to receive from above. So the psila is like a keli, like in this case, the divine soul. That's a fitting keli to be able to produce air, because the neshama is bottled, the Nefesh Shalikis is bottled. It is humble, and it is what's the word I want to use? Has suspended itself, doesn't have an ego. Therefore, it's the perfect kais or keli, like he calls it, to receive elikus. Okay. This he explains for a while. Pidge, I said, I want to just give the summary. I'm just quickly going through it from the word naftali. Yeah, good. Okay. Okay, then he concludes like this. We're still talking about the psila. Kamoi kain b'neshama b'chinas psila he b'nefesh alikis, but haneshama hamelubesha is beguf. It's not just the soul its own; it's the neshama as it manifests in the body. The tachlis yishan lamati b'shvil nefesh abamis, because the purpose of the soul coming down below is for the animal soul, because the neshama itself does not need repair. It comes down to refine and radiate and illuminate and transform the animal soul. And as the neshama is below, it's in the state of makabel, like a bas, like a daughter. And that's like the psila that's makabel, the oir, the psila, the wick that's receiving the oir. Yeah. Makabel se'er aliki umer ba nefesh abamis. Now let's go back. What are the other two things? Now that you established that the wick is the neshama as it comes down below, manifesting inside of a body. And that's why the wick is connected to the earth. So he says like this now. Hashemen hu aseichel hativi de nefesh abamis. The shemen, the oil, is the seichel hativi, the natural intelligence of the animal soul. Because the soul comes down into the body and the animal soul. And that, the goal is that the nefesh alikis should use the animal soul's intelligence as fuel to fuel the divine. The animal soul's intelligence on its own can be serving its own self-interest. But here the kavanah is that the psila should draw the shemen toward Kedusha, towards creating an Eir Eliki. We'll talk about the Eir in a moment. So the shemen is Seichel Hativi de Nefesh Abamis, or what he calls Chachma of Nefesh Abamis, the Chachma of the animal soul. And what's the Eir? The third thing that's produced now through the neshama below. Ha'Eir hu ha'Eir Eliki shebay nichle v'nisrif hashemen hu ha'seichel hativi liyas nichlel be'elikus. The fire that's produced is the divine fire that comes by consuming the animal soul, directing it. And like we learned earlier, we learned about transforming it to the point it gets consumed and burned up with the Nefesh Elikis's power. So it should also be encompassed in Nichlal, it should be included in Elikus. I'll read this inside. Through the work and the effort of a divine contemplation.
Please? Where are you holding, please? Where exactly on 152? 1352.
1351. The end of the paragraph. Through the work and the effort in a divine contemplation, and the stimulation, awakening, and arousal of love and reverence, that in his spirit, in the soul, is radiating the divine light. It causes a bittul also in the shemen, meaning in the animal soul. That is too should be directed to what? To a flame that is also avos Hashem, that is the love of God. This is the whole purpose of the soul coming down below, to radiate the darkness of the animal soul, the darkness of the world. You're familiar with all these terms because we've been learning them throughout, especially recently. And this is the meaning that the psila, the wick, attaches, connects. So the shemen is the wisdom, intelligence of the animal soul. The psila is the neshama that comes down, the nefesh elikis, into a guf and nefesh habamis. The psila serves as a purpose of that also the animal soul. The shemen shouldn't just be serving itself, should be feeding, fueling divine love. So it should also be nichel gamkim ba'er eliki, by dezen nimshal gili el yeser. And by doing that, something greater is achieved to the neshama that the neshama would never have achieved on its own. Because the neshama lamaila it doesn't deal with all of this. The neshama lamaila is just an earth of its own, like we've learned and we're learning here. It's the neshama comes down below as it has to exert itself and make an effort. So it's the nefesh habamis that draws out something from the nefesh elikis below that it would not have on its own. That's the three dimensions of ner, psila, shemen, and oir in the neshama. Let me go over the three things in the mitzvah, and then we'll understand much better how he's going to connect it all to page 1463, where we're up to now. It's already becoming apparent, because if you think about Shechera and Ivanov is exactly this, that through the darkness below, which means through the darkness of the animal soul and this world, that's the darkness, like he says, on its own. So what are you doing? The Nefesh Elikis is serving a role to direct and transform that to loving God. And that creates an oir that's much greater, Vinova, a beauty that's much greater. The Rebbe Rashab said explicitly, if you look on page 1355, he said it explicitly. He said that through the Nefesh Habamis, the Nefesh Elikis reaches a far higher level. So now we're starting to see, I'll talk about mitzvah in a moment, Ner mitzvah. We're starting to see the Rebbe Rashab's 110 pages came to explain this idea. What does it mean that a neshama gets empowered when it comes down below? It would seem to be counterintuitive that a neshama above is on such a high level. But now we've learned that length as the neshama comes down below, everything that's accomplished. In other words, going back to the Eir Hariyah that he's going to explain it with, that the soul has the power to see. But we're talking now that then the power to see enters into the eye, and then in the eye it's limited. It won't see in the dark. It needs outside light to support it. But once you have that outside light, you trigger the very essential power of the neshama, of the power to see, and you reach its highest levels of riyah. And where does the Riyah come from? He said the Riyah comes from the pupil of the eye, the darkness of the eye, which is representative of the Nefesh Habamis. So the only thing you have to keep in mind, Shemen, most people would think Shemen seems to be very a powerful thing. Shemen is the oil. The oil would be like in the Torah, Shemen Zayazach, pure olive oil, is in the Menorah in the Beis Hamikdash is a very high level. However, here in this explanation, which is based on the Alter Rebbe's Memorim of Chanukah, Shemen is the Nefesh Habamis. We're talking about the Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis. Shemen in general is Chachma. It could be Chachma de Kedusha, it could be Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis. Here, we're talking about transforming the animal soul, and that's the process. So before we go back to where we're up to learn, let me just go through now, slowly, quickly summarize the bottom of 1351 and to the end of the paragraph on 1352. This is shorter, because once we've established these three things, how does it work in a mitzvah? Where do you find a wick and an oil or fuel and the fire and the light in a mitzvah? So he says at the bottom of 1351, a mitzvah also has these three things. Psila is the mitzvah itself. As the Ratzon Elyon, just like we talked about the Nefesh Elikis, is a divine energy that manifests inside of a body and animal soul. So a mitzvah is Ratzon Elyon, is God's will or desire. That's why it's a psila. Yes, it's God's will, but God's will that manifests in some physical item. That's the wick. And what's the purpose of a mitzvah? Like the purpose of the Nefesh Elikis coming down below. Just like a Nefesh Elikis comes down below into the body and animal soul in order to elevate and refine them, and then get elevated in the process, get elevated to a higher level. The same thing with mitzvahs. Through the mitzvahs, that way you take cloth, you take the parchment, which was animal skin, animal hide, or you take tzitzis, which was wool from a sheep, and then you turn it into a mitzvah. So you take a physical item in the mitzvah and turning it into a channel for Ratzon Elyon, for God's will. The same thing with every mitzvah. So it says the chayesh shel ma'aseh mitzvahs v'kiyum bot legam legabe Ratzon Elyon v'lasem mamish keguf leneshama, like a levush achitzin, like the levush achitzin, ken al levush achitzin shal nefesh elikis. Okay, so that's what a mitzvah is. So I'm turning the page 1352. He says, "Hagilim amaylash of ma'aseh mitzvahs has a mekarev kol advarim gashmim shein tachas mamshalas klipas negam hari nechlolim ha'yedei mitzvah belakus." That through the mitzvah we take physical objects that on their own would be neutral or self-serving even, and the mitzvah turns them toward God, directs them to be godly vehicles, godly expressions, divine channels. He adds another thing: a mitzvah also has the power to elevate the animal soul and connect it to Ein Sof. Before we get to Torah that he mentions here, it says like this now. Let's talk. He still didn't talk about, okay. So
what's
here,
the shemen?
very
What's the
briefly,
shemen in this mashal?
I'm middle of explaining. So now he goes on to explain and says like this. I'm going to get back to Torah in a minute, but a mitzvah saying I'm a chamas Torah. Okay. So basically, he's using the same three things. In this case, just like we said before, that the psila is the divine soul, the shemen is the intelligence or the chachma of the animal soul, and the oir is the transformation of the animal soul. Excuse me. So he says here, the Gashmius says in the end of the paragraph, he says, "Aseichel hativi mishapach mamish mehipuch el hafuch." That the shemen would be the same idea. The animal soul that the mitzvahs are transforming into a Ner Neshomo. He doesn't spell it out explicitly. He just says, look at all this in the Maimer Miyash Kashem Alekeni Hamagbi. It's the Maimer in Torah In a number of places he explains it. But briefly, it's the same idea. Just like a Nefesh Alekis, which actually through mitzvahs and Torah mitzvahs, Nefesh Alekis transforms the shemen and the fuel, and the animal soul becomes fuel to feed the divine soul, and therefore it creates an oir of Avos Hashem. So the mitzvah, the Ratzon Elyon, does the same thing. It takes the physical world, which becomes the fuel, because you can't have tefillin without cloth, without parchment, without physical item. You can't light a candle without, a candle is the example he's using. You can't have tzitzis, usually brings tzitzis without a physical item. So the physical item is serving as fuel. That's the shemen, which in turn creates a Ner Neshomo down below, that the physical world is fueling and feeding the divine revelation. That's essentially what he says on page 1352. One more piece. He does mention Torah Eir. I want to emphasize it because I think it's going to be very relevant to the end of Ayin Beis, because I don't know if he comes back to Torah Eir completely. So the more we have signs, telltale signs that can help us understand the plot, the better it is. So he says that mitzvahs is called Ner because that's more limited, like a candle. And Torah, he says, it's a core energy. So even though a mitzvah is Ratzon Elyon, it's also coming from Atzmus Ein Sof, but it's a Ratzon, a specific desire, whether mitfil and tzitzis. Torah is in general Torah Eir. Okay, so he talks about B'chinas Torah, the Omuk means B'chinas Pnimius v'Atzmus Eir Shalamaylam B'chinas Hagilui. That's where Torah is rooted. Okay, Atzmus Ein Sof. Eira Torah nechaz ba'apsila. And how does Torah manifest itself? So it nechaz in the psila, it grasps, hold on to the wick, sheheina mitzvahs. So Torah, how does Torah express itself to us? It tells us what the mitzvahs we should do. Sheheina mitzvahs, ki kol ha-Torah shalifnei, and Torah shebiksav, Torah shebiksav, ikram v'yiseidin hu b'mitzvahs. Torah itself is God's wisdom, is God's will, and is God's wisdom, the blueprint, if you wish, the general blueprint. But it's when it says, okay, so that's telling us what God wants. But the mitzvahs is actually the fulfillment of that through actual commandments, through the specific things that are the mitzvahs. So we see here that the mitzvahs connect the Eir of Torah with Adam va'elam. Now, according to this, if you recall, I don't know if you recall back then, you could also interpret, and I believe in Torah Eir, there's another interpretation, that based on this, psila would be the mitzvahs, oir, the light, the oir, Eir Torah would be Torah, and remember I'm sorry, Eir Torah would be maybe shemen even. This would be a different interpretation. And a machaber, the shemen, with what? With the physical world. And that's what creates the oir. Mitzvahs and macham, like he said before, the psila connects the shemen with the oil, that the light, the oil itself, the fuel, doesn't burn. It needs a wick. So basically, the Torah needs the mitzvahs in order to connect Torah with the human being in this world by fulfilling God's will through these mitzvahs. That's what it looks like from this line here. But then afterwards, he says, "V'husha nefesh habamis v'chol advarim nechlolim ba'er Torah." And then he says that nefesh habamis, and everything of this physical world becomes encompassed in Ner Torah. So either way, the end of the story is that it's encompassing also the animal soul, like he explained before with the neshama. But this is already more intricate. I don't want to go into the details because it's not so relevant to our bigger discussion. Bottom line is we have three things here. We have a wick, which is in the neshama, is the neshama that manifests inside the body, that becomes the thing that connects the shemen, which is the light of the wisdom of the animal soul, or the wisdom of the Torah in a mitzvah. And there's the mitzvah, I'm sorry, let's not say that right now. And then there's the light that's created when the divine soul transforms the animal soul to loving God. So it creates a Ner Neshomo. And that Ner Neshomo is even greater than the Ner as it is Lamaila. before it comes down into a wick down below. In the mitzvah, similar idea. The mitzvah is Ratzna Elyon that manifests in the mitzvah in the wick. Torah, you could say, is maybe the level of shemen. He doesn't say it explicitly, and is the mitzvah that connects Torah with the world and the human being. But there you also need to have an animal soul and a physical body, because that's where the mitzvah manifests. It manifests inside of those and transforms it all toward a Eira Leki. Only thing he adds that element of Torah in here. So with that, we summed up what we learned on those pages. Now, I'm going to go back. We have some time, so I'm going to go back to page 1463, and now you'll see that then, when he finished there on page 1352, so what did he say? He said like this, if you go there, 1352, he said like this. Let me just read the continuation there. That's what he says. After he explained this whole thing with Ner, he says, the new paragraph on 1352, according to what it says elsewhere about Eir Hariyah, the power, the light of vision or eyesight. Which even though it's Eir, but that Eir is concealed and needs to have an outside light to support it. And that began the whole discussion with Eir Hariyah, as I summed up. And after all that, he comes now back to Uma'ata Tzarech Lahavin Masher Kosav, the top of page 1463. I know I gave a long introduction here, but I do want to start the next paragraph. If anybody wants to ask something, fine. But the real point of all of this was to introduce the flow and the segue from all these pages to the new section now on page 1463. But if you want to ask anything, feel free. I would wait till we see the connection. That's what I would suggest. Okay. So top of 1463 says like this. Uma'ata tzarich lahavin masher kosav ner Hashem nishmas adam. What it says, that the flame of God, the fire of the candle of God, is the soul of a human being. Uksiv k'ner mitzvah, and it says that the mitzvah is called also a candle. Shaneshama nikra ner v'chein hamitzvahs nikraim ner. So we see that he's going back to that theme now, the idea of a ner, v'nizboyer, and it was explained. Where was it explained? What I just summed up on page 1350 through 1352. What was explained? The ner kel shemen psila of oir. A ner, a candle, consists of three things: a shemen, oil, psila, a wick, and oir, the light that it creates. The gimel inyano el yeshna b'ner de neshama or b'ner de mitzvahs. These three elements, these three components, you have them both in the ner of the neshama, the candle of the soul, and you have them the candle of mitzvahs. B'nizbayer, and how do we explain that? Again, he's referring all to what he said back there. As I said, 110 pages back. The b'ner the neshama apsili hi neshama. In Ner Neshomo, the wick is the soul, the divine soul, he means. The kamoi, the mashal, like it is in the example, the ner, like it is in the example, haner the mashal haner, like it is in the example of the candle, hapsila sheyeves es hashemen, the oil, the wick draws. Sheyevis is like when you draw water from a well, you call it she'iva. So here, the psila is drawing the shemen, and you could actually, I don't know if you could actually physically see it, but you could almost see it. The psila is a dry wick made out of cotton or made out of some other material, and it serves like it draws. As the fire keeps burning, it draws more and more oil through it. Sheyevis is shemen shenichla v'nisrev ba'er. And that shemen, nichla, is being consumed, v'nisrav, and being burned. Another word like being consumed. You could say being consumed and being subsumed. Ba'ir, in the light, in the flame. And through that causes the earth to be a very bright, a very clear light. In other words, if there was no shemen, the wick would either burn out, and so what you need to have here is the oil is being consumed. That's the paradox. As the oil is being consumed, it feeds the psila to burn very beautifully, smoothly, quietly, like we see when the flames are burning properly and the way they should be burning, and the candles are burning. You see the fuel continues to be exhausted, but while it's and being drawn into the psila, and the flame is a beautiful flame all the while. So that's in the mashal. What's the nimshal by a neshama? Kamoi kain, who, so too is it with the neshama. Shashemen hu anefesh habamis. The oil is the animal soul. Vapsilo, and the wick shehi haneshama hamlubeshes beguf. That's the soul that manifests in a body, in a psila, and a wick. Sheyeves es hanefesh habamis. Just like the wick is drawing the oil, the divine soul in the body is drawing the oil of the animal soul. So that's what it's doing. That's the goal. That the nefesh halikis control and uses and draws the animal soul should be directed to be encompassed in the Eid Aliki of the neshama, in the divine flame, the divine fire, the divine light of the soul. And when that's done properly, that causes there should be a yisur there. Not just that the neshama has also included the animal soul. That propels and that creates that there should be an additional eir in the neshama that it wouldn't have had on its own if it did not make this effort of drawing from the shemen of the animal soul into it. Like we learned that the work with the animal soul, like Shcheirani, draws out deeper strengths from the soul, from the nefesh halikis, to the point of anova, of the beauty that we learned, the higher levels of experience that the neshama has as a result of coming down into this world and engaging with the animal soul. So that's a summary of what we learned before in the context of only the neshama. He hasn't talked about a mitzvah now. I believe he may, I'm almost sure he does, but right now he's talking about the neshama. So briefly, what I would say is, so why do we need 110 pages to understand this? Because there's a lot of aspects that if you start breaking it down are not so clear. Like, first of all, what exactly is the process? Why is it that way that it happens, that it's dafka below that you reach these high levels? That doesn't say in Torah Er, in the Maimorim that talk about the Ner. It just says that's what the flame, that's what the animal soul does. We've learned the reason because the Midbar is a place of an arid, desolate place, and it brings us to tremendous thirst and yearning, and also brings us to our appreciation that Atmos is beyond everything, and everything compared to Atmos is desolate and lifeless. So that is part of what, one of the things explained. So if you go through the last 110 pages, especially about Eir HaRiyah, you have a much more elaborate and comprehensive understanding of these three components of how the Nefesh HaLikis interacts with the body and the animal soul, with the shemen, and in turn produces this light. Now he's going to discuss this more at length now, what the shemen is, to be more precise, because he really only spoke about shemen as being chachma, and in this case, chachma the nefesh habamis. Now he's going to speak more details from that Maimer in Torah Er that he referred to on page 1352. So I will, let me see here. Should we I think I'm going to stop here. I'll stop for questions, because now he's going to explain by inyan hu d'hinei shemen u'b'chinas chachma. He's going to explain this level of shemen in more detail. What the shemen is, what this oil, the fuel is. I see that goes for, yeah. And as we go the next few pages, you're going to see he's going to interweave the ideas that were spoken about back in 1350 to 1352 with everything we learned in the last 100 pages. Going to bring it all together in a very eloquent way. So you'll see how it all comes together. and also see the power of this example of Er Hariyah, how that's very valuable in understanding it all. But this will develop as we go. As I said, the next good few pages, let me see here. I would say all the way he comes back to Ner, to the Ner here on page 1466. 1466, he's gonna, after he connects it all, he's gonna go back to Ner Mitzvah. The Ner Mitzvah also has these three elements, as we said. Maybe things will get a little clearer. And that's why I feel that the Rebbe Rashab is winding down, so to speak, because once he speaks about Ner Mitzvah, then the only thing left to explain is Torah, which is the beginning of page 1350. So it's likely, yes, the Rebbe Rashab could definitely have spent written another 100 or 1,000 pages for all we know. But in context, at least of the flow, we're definitely going to cover Ner Mitzvah. And then the last thing is Torah, which is the Hamshach Mamai Lamata that illuminates. So my feeling at this point is that pretty confident that we're going to be able to figure out, not everything, obviously, you can't guess what the Rebbe Rashab would have done, but at least to have a pretty much closure on most of the themes that he's addressing, even though there are topics that he did not finish. He asked questions and didn't answer, but we'll see how that evolves. So right now, our next section is 3 more pages, 1463 to 1466. Then he's going to go back to Ner Mitzvah. Okay, so let's stop here by the period on top of page 1463, and I'll take any questions.
First of all, I wanted to say, first of all, this was thrilling. It was like a philosophical movie drama that that you wove together, and this is one of the most exciting classes I think we've had, for me, that I've had since we started 1352. So thank you. That was a masterful integration of all this, and it really helped me understand what we just learned over the past 110 plus pages. It got me so excited because, among other things, maybe I'm jumping the gun here. You'll probably say I am, but I wonder if this is where he's coming to say that the Gashmias and the goof and the of this lowest world will ultimately yield the light, that Ein Od will yield the light, that Elikus will learn from Gashmias, because the Gashmias is the fuel, and without the fuel elevates the Elikus even higher. So that is to say, it's really so beautiful, because what the Rebbe Rashab is coming to say, I'm positing something. I'm asking if you think this is true. That Dafka, this lowest world, this filled with Gashmias, and has our body and all our taivas and all these things, is mamash the fuel that leads to higher Elikus, and it's actually an exaltation. It's a sublimation. It's an elevation. It's a celebration of Gashmias and the goof, not stam for the lowest aspects of it, the taivas. Of course, he's not saying that. He's saying it has the potential to fuel, to drive our neshamas even higher than they were than before they came down into this body. And it essentially, even though it's a study of Elikus, it is also a celebration of life in this world. It's stunningly beautiful. What do you think about that?
To me, it's obvious, frankly. That's the whole theme of Ayin Beis. So my answer is yes, that's correct.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure I'm getting it. Thank you. It was unbelievable.
I mean, it's even more elaborate than that, but to use the language of Ayin Beis in the middle of volume 2, remember, it's all interface. Interface is the theme of Ayin Beis from page 1. Interface between what? Between this material world and the divine and God. So it has to include everything, both the neshama and the nefesh habamis and this physical world. You call celebration, so it includes it all. The question is how, and each step requires its own process. So middle of volume 2, when he asked the big question, how can we transform, how can we experience post-symptom, a pre-symptom consciousness? How can we experience pre-symptom reality or pre-symptom consciousness post-symptom? So that began a long discussion of transforming the symptom, recognizing that the symptom itself is in order to bring gilui, havayu elikim v'yadaita hayoyim v'shavesa levecha ki havayu elikim b'shamayim emal v'oretz mitochas. In volume 3, he added the ein oid, that the very Helam itself reveals Helam Atzmi, or expresses Helam Atzmi. So the point being that was the central theme all the way from very early on, midway through volume 2, even though in truth it's already a theme of volume 1. So it's basically all about doing exactly that, transforming this world. And that Tzimtzum, he said clearly in Aved is the Nefesh Abamis. Nefesh Abamis is the manifestation. He talked about Chassidus applied, the manifestation of the Tzimtzum on a personal level is the animal soul that does all this concealing. And then there's the transformation of it. So I didn't really go into explaining the connection to volume 2 and earlier volumes. Here I wanted to really connect page 1350 to where we are now. But if you broaden it, it definitely includes all of that. And yes, and the big part of the earlier part of Ayin Beis talks a lot more about the higher levels of Giluyim, the hidden spheres. So we're talking here about bringing godliness firstly from the highest levels downward all the way into Atzilus. Then we're talking about bringing it after Atzilus through the Parsa, the partition between Atzilus and Biyah, or in other words, after the Tzimtzum, to bring it all post-Tzimtzum, and then the transformation of the very Tzimtzum, even the lowest and darkest parts of it, which is all this central theme here. The key thing that is going to be important here is the difference between Mamata Lamayla and Mayla Lamata, because that's the real structure the Rebbe Rashab set up from the middle of volume 2, and 1350, that's how it starts. That Torah is Mamayla Lamata. But what is becoming also apparent, and I've mentioned a number of times, that it's a little more complicated than that. The Mamayla Lamata of Torah, also in Torah, also you have a Mamat Lamayla. When we learn Torah, that's our effort, especially Torah Shabbat Peh, especially Talmud. Then there comes mitzvahs. Is mitzvahs Mamayla Lamata or Mamat Lamayla? Mitzvahs were given to us from above, but a mitzvah is essentially taking the physical world and directing it toward godliness. Tefillah is definitely more mamata lamayla, but we learned in Tefillah too, Shema has a mamayla lamata, yichud elah, a yichud mamayla lamata, and a yichud mamata lamayla. We learned it explicitly. So all that is also going to be, that's me, a very critical piece in this whole piece. My assumption is, and I'm only saying as an assumption, even though it's pretty clear to me, but I want to see it really evidence when we learn it inside, that Torah is mostly mamayla lamata. It has a mamata lamayla element. Tefillah is mostly mamata lamayla, but it has a mamayla lamata element as well. And mitzvahs is somewhere in between. That's why it's like a psila, which is like a mechaber, because he uses that word interface. A psila is the wick that connects, he said, Torah with the world. He also says a wick is also what connects the animal soul with the divine. So that's the wick. And the neshama really plays the role of all this, because the neshama is the active player that implements all of this. Torah and mitzvahs and a world and an animal soul, we can't get anywhere without a neshama, because the neshama is the key, is the ultimate, the other makava are born. They're the ones that are going to execute all this. So neshama also has all these elements. Neshama lamayla in the highest levels of Oir, and even higher than Oir, as we learned. Neshama, then there's Torah, the Torah that illuminates the neshama, and the neshama comes down below to the point that it gets dark, and then it needs Torah Oir and Malachim and everything to support it. But then the neshama elevates higher than everything, back to Atzmus and even higher, and all this has propelled it. The Torah Oir and the Malachim have helped it Mamayla Lamata. The Nefesh Abamis has helped it Mamata Lamayla through Tefillah and so on. And Adam Dain is you have a tremendous connection, a tremendous fusion, I should say, between the divine and existence interface, and it's both Mamayla Lamata. The qualities of Mamayla Lamata are many. They're the Mamayla of Giluyim that empower us, and Mamata Lamayla is the power of integration that has all been transformed from within. So that's really, since you already brought it up, I decided to just give the whole package deal here. And that's really what is ultimately seems to be where this is going to all come together. The crescendo, if you wish, and climax of this whole Ayin Beis is coming to I believe, this conclusion that I just spelled out here. Briefly. We're going to learn more inside, and the question is how much the Rebbe Rashab actually spells out, and how much of this needs to be filled in a bit by us.
Fantastic. Wonderful. I think this class should be the beginning introduction to Ayin Beis, frankly.
Yeah, well, but if you haven't learned this idea, many people will be lost in this. There's too many.
But you just gave the whole map. You just mapped out 1,463 pages. That was unbelievable. I mean, I gave a high level, but you filled it in. I mean, I hit the tip of the iceberg. You really filled it in. Wow, that was really powerful. Really powerful. Thank you. Really appreciate how you've integrated all these things. Brought all of our classes together into one picture. Beautiful. Beautiful.
Does
anybody else want to comment or ask anything?
Yeah, I have a question. When
You're
we're talking
welcome.
about,
you're very welcome. I acknowledge your thank you.
And excitement.
And excitement, absolutely. I'm also excited.
The question I have is, when we're talking about near mitzvah and taking the physical cloth, as you say, in the physical world, which is, I think you said it's a shemen, and elevating it through the psila to produce a light. How do we explain negative mitzvahs, lo ta'aseh, which don't have a chiza in the physical world? Do they exist in shemen also, or how is that? How do we understand that if it's not utilizing the physical world to bring to produce this light? The negative are.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear the question. Well, in context, I would say a few things. If you look in my Morim of Chassidus and Likutei Torah, Pekudei, and other places, where he speaks about positive and negative mitzvahs, he says the positive mitzvahs are more drawing divine energy within existence, and the negative mitzvahs are introducing that which is above existence. That's why it's not through an action; it's through a non-action. An action means like you're drawing it into and integrating it into tefillin, tzitzis, kashrus, stucca, whatever. Aloisa he says, and not doing it, basically restraining yourself and refraining from doing something requires energy, and that energy is amshach from sevav kalam. Sevav kalam does not have a keli, so it's not manifest in an action; it's manifest in a withholding from an action. So he doesn't say it here explicitly, obviously, he doesn't mention it, but it fits in very well, because when you are refining the animal soul, you need two things. Think of a garden. You need to plant seeds and you need to nurture and water the garden, but you also have to weed it. You have to weed it. You have to uproot all the negative toxins that can disturb. So to tame an animal soul requires two things. I'm just adding this. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't say this. One is that you direct the animal soul's energy, shemen, its oil, its wisdom, towards divine love and reverence and divine energy, but you also curb its desires and taivas. And Loisas does that part. Loisas keeps the animal soul from following its own interests. So though he doesn't say that part, but that's where I would fit it in into this context.
You mean, in a sense, it's making sure
it's
that
almost
you have
like keeping
pure oil?
Keeping the oil clean.
Pure, yeah.
And pure, not allowing toxins to get in there.
Very good. Pure oil, purifying the oil. Shemen zayit zach.
Yeah, because for example, if the animal soul is following its own taivas, right, and then suddenly you say v'ahavtas Hashem lekecha, it's even if the animal soul is ready, it's just too toxic. It needs a little cleanup. You don't bring in new furniture until you clean the dust out.
The other question I had was that these three aspects that the Rebbe Rashab talks about.
I just want to say, however, this is my
interpretation.
I would want to look in Torah to see if the Alter Rebbe refers to it at all. I don't think so, but this is my way I would add into it. Okay, in answering your question, go ahead.
The three aspects of the Ner and the sila, and the or, it would seem like there would need to be a fourth one aspect of the igniting light. I mean, you have three aspects there, right? You have a oil with a wick, but it needs to be ignited. And I would think that might be the or Torah, the or, not only the or that's given off once it's ignited, but you would need to have or a Torah to mila lamata to ignite that, or in the first that candle, that near those three aspects in the first place. Otherwise, nothing's going to burn, nothing's going to work.
That may be the idea, just like the eye can't see in the dark and needs an outside light to get it going. And then once you have the light, then the eye itself can see.
Right.
It's probably correct. Why doesn't it mention a fourth? Remember, you're going all the way to the Alter Rebbe. Because at the end of the day, al pi halacha, a ner, what is ner? When you say something is a ner, you're not talking about the action of lighting the ner. What makes a ner a ner? In halacha, you need a wick, you need oil, and you need you need light. Without that, you can't be mekayim the mitzvah. What you're talking already is how we actually get it going. But here he's actually coming to explain the verse ner. Why does it mean ner? The three aspects. But it is correct to say you need a igniter. You need the kohen gadol to light the menorah. That's like a fourth element. But the menorah itself consists of these three things. That's just the key point here.
Right. Because
okay. Yeah, but look. As what you're doing is somewhat applying this, not so much understanding this, because he's not going there. The Rebbe Rashab did not feel the need to spell that out, at least until here, just pointing that out. I just want to, I want to respect what the Rebbe Rashab says, and then we can sit and bring whatever we want to say, but it's another step in this process.
But you couldn't have that third aspect of the light, or without a light ignition from before. I mean, a candle would be oil and a wick. And then it says or.
That's not what Ayin Beis is talking about. It's fine, but that's a conversation we can have. It's Ayin Beis, because then let me ask you something. If it's so important, why did the Rebbe Rashab forget that point? He forgot this point?
Of course
not. Because what he wants to talk about are these three things. It's correct to say that you need a person to light. I got it. I understand you can't have the oil, but that's not the discussion. Here's the discussion why it's called ner. To make a ner, you need these three things. Yes, then you need the individual that comes and actually lights it. If you don't have a match, or you light it from another fire, I got it. You could have shemen, and you could have the oil, you could have the wick, and then how do you get the air going? I understand what you're saying, and that's why I said I acknowledge that it could be Torah is what ignites it, or some other outside force that gets it going, like the light that allows our eye to see. I just am distinguishing to what it says here and what we're discussing. That's all I'm doing.
I've got you. And I just want to make one.
How could I argue with the fact you can't light a flame? The flames don't light themselves. I got it.
One, and which fits in perfectly what the Rebbe been saying, that the eyes, as you just brought down, the eyesight needs or in order to see, and it needs a seal. It needs help in this world.
In other words, as powerful as the neshama is, as powerful as Torah is down on earth, you need some, not Torah, as far as the neshama is, it needs something to get to shine, to get the light going, because it's too dark. This world is a dark world. Good, that's correct. That would work, yes.
Beautiful. And one last comment is a comment. Just take it for whatever it is. The three aspects, Hashemin, Sila, and Or, they're exact same letters as Hashemin is Neshama. Sila is Tefillah, davening, exact same letters. And Or is, if you rearrange the same letters, is Ra'u, to see. Ru'uvein, to see them.
Okay.
So you have Neshama, Tefillah, and seeing. And it may be connection. I just thought that was interesting.
That's good.
That's just a comment.
Yeah, by all means.
Very nice, Eliezer.
Rabbi, could you see this not as a justification for suffering, but a sort of an explanation of what this whole struggle is about? That there, the Nefesh HaBehemoth enables us and all the struggles that it encounters.
Not only I see this is a theme I've talked about probably thousands of times. We don't understand why they're suffering, but we do understand once we are in this world that it can bring out the deepest strengths. And God created a world where there would be potential for suffering. So we don't explain why it happens, but we know what we could do with it and how we can grow from it. Yeah. I mean, here, this is not the theme here, suffering right now, we're learning, but the general idea of a soul coming down below and facing all the challenges, at the end of the day, is that will bring out the greatest strengths. So Mashiach comes, we'll only have the benefits that will have that have been derived from it, not the negative. But part of the negative was part of the concealment, as we've discussed many times. The concealment is not an end in itself, but it is a means to get to much higher places. Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we stop here. That's 7 lines, top of page 1463, and we shall continue.